Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Better You podcast, sponsored by LAMCO Wellness. Today, we are talking about overdoses, which I think is a very important and also very scary topic. Um, the goal is, after watching, we want you to be more prepared to recognize an overdose, respond appropriately, talk about overdoses without stigma, and understand the recovery is possible, because that's ultimately what is important. And from a from a legal disclaimer perspective, LAMCO Wellness is not a crisis center, and we do not handle overdoses strictly, but we can be an important part of the recovery. And that is what is ultimately the goal after an overdose or after something like that is recovery. So, without any further ado, I'd love to get started by defining the problem. Ali, I know you've worked in the crisis centers for quite some time. Um, Tell us what we don't know about an overdose.
Yes, absolutely. And just kind of piggyback on one of the other reasons why we decided to discuss this topic today is held globally every year on August 31st is International Overdose Awareness Day. We know it's not limited to just one day. This is something that, especially on the crisis lines, we, take very seriously. And as clinicians, we want to ensure that people are educated on what the signs are, to be able to help people. I know we see quite a bit of, different things in the news. So education and raising awareness about the risks of overdose, recognizing like physical signs and understanding that overdoses are preventable. Just to also disclose, I'm not a medical professional. So, some questions that can be asked of me today, whether it's live chat or here, I can't, answer, administering Narcan or anything like that. So, this is strictly a conversation where, we can educate you guys, a little bit, but kind of go into your question, Aaron. Yes, I have a lot of experience working on the crisis lines. And yeah, sometimes, you know, I've seen individuals where maybe they are in an active overdose or, their symptoms are mimicking psychosis or, hallucinations because of the use of whatever substances or combination they've been on. So it can be tricky to de-escalate someone, but also understand, is this a psychosis episode or is this a substance-induced psychosis episode?
Yeah, I think that's really important. I have had family members and friends who have effectively overdosed on some substance, and their perception of reality is, to say unreliable is is a wild understatement. And it can be it can be tricky, and it can also kind of distort your perception of them, because you're remembering, hey, this is who they are. They're, crazy or whatever, and they think these crazy things. And I've had a family member who was took too much of something and was otherwise fine, but uh, would say and believe some very radical and insane things. Like, they moved fine, their speech was fine. It's just their perception of reality was totally off. And for me, it took me a really long time to be like, oh, that was that was overdose related. That wasn't who they are. Although the substance problem is still uh, an underlying issue, or can be an underlying issue.
Yeah, absolutely. And when you're mentioning about overdose, right? Like there's a few different types of overdoses that we are trained in the field to see. So somebody can reach out. So for example, like to a crisis line, right? And they're starting to experience some physical symptoms. Hey, I'm getting dizzy. Hey, I'm having some stomach issues. In the past when working with individuals in crisis, my role was to ensure, like, okay, is this a medical emergency? Was this accidental? Or was this with the intention to maybe end their life? These are the questions and clarifications that we need to know the next steps for the person. But whether it was with intention to end their life or, medical emergency, they're still having symptoms, they're still acting erratically, they're still dizzy, they're operating a car, there's so many different scenarios that I've worked with where, you need to get the individual help. Now, again, I'm not a medical provider, so I can't say like exactly like, oh, this is exactly what you do or this is exactly what you look for, but there are key physical signs that as a clinician, we are trained to you know, act essentially, especially when there's disclosure of this being on purpose, but also if the person's like, hey, like my oxygen level's not normally 85, I need some help.
I'm curious to know in that sense of like you mentioned different types of overdose. So my next question was for to you both is like what would you define an overdose as, right? Where like a normal person, if they're drinking constantly, like every single day, like casual, would that be an overdose? Or has to be like misabusing the heck out of, whatever that's going on with you.
Well, it's funny you mentioned that, Ravi, because I remember my training in grad school. Um, and I laugh because it was just such an interesting group topic that we did. It wasn't a pen and pad, it wasn't like, a big test or anything, but our teacher, who, I mean, he was a great professor. He's like, all right, I want everybody to raise their hand after I ask these questions. He's like, okay, on a Friday, if you had a great week, who maybe has a drink? A few people raise their hand. All right, if something bad happens during the week, can somebody raise their hand if they have a drink? He went through all the different prompts and he's like, okay, well, in the morning when you wake up, what's the first thing you do? Do you go to Starbucks or Dunkin'? Do you get a coffee? Okay, raise your hand. Basically, he's like, a lot of you meet the criteria for substance use disorders, whether you know it or not. Coffee use, caffeine, all that kind of stuff. So, there was a really interesting group, we'll say case study. And, the reason I mentioned that as a correlation here is because, hey, maybe somebody does drink every week and they start to experience some headaches, that to me, it's not an active overdose, but they're withdrawal symptoms. So that means you've had a dependence on whatever that substance is. And believe it or not, coffee's a substance too. So while you can't necessarily overdose. I mean, people with heart issues and things like that have to be very careful, like with tachycardia when they use like caffeinated substances, but you can have a codependence. So, um, yeah, I mean that there are different signs of withdrawal. So that's why, as clinicians and even medical providers, they're very, very careful. Like if somebody's, been drinking for a long period of time, maybe they're on painkillers, or they're prescribed mental health medications, they have to be super, super careful of what concoctions they mix.
Okay.
Yep. I I by no means have the correct response to this. I just know how I personally have defined it. And I would also kind of to piggyback on what Ali was saying, I think that a lot of times we look at overdosing as, you know, oh, somebody has a needle in their arm and they're about to die or whatever. And in my experience, which I think is more than the average person, but not much more, um, it's more often just that somebody has had more than their body can handle, and it's coming out in unexpected and probably negative ways. Um, like I laughed when when you said when you were talking about coffee and everything, Ali, because by those definitions, I think I've overdosed. When I was in my early 20s, I was drinking energy drinks like nonstop, and then I would go out and party and do like Jaeger bombs with Red Bull and everything. And I was out at a party and just collapsed because basically my heart stopped functioning right, and I had to go to the ER and everything like that. And the doctor was like, "You need to stop with caffeine for like potentially ever." And yeah, we often think of somebody who has an addiction problem as, this type of thing, but it can happen with most substances that we use. Um, and it's scary. And I think you talked about something that's very important, and something that we try to focus on in what we're doing, and that I think everybody should be aware of when they're looking at overdoses or addiction problems is it's not necessarily about, you know, getting them fully healed. I mean, obviously that is the goal, but the immediate concern should always be what is the next step. Um, I think a lot of people jump to, oh, the intervention, or the the go away recovery clinic, or something like that. And a lot of times it's like the most important thing is, okay, what is the next step? This is somebody who's hopefully not, but in this fictitious example, this is somebody who's overusing drugs, be they prescribed or not prescribed, um, regularly, to the point that it's a problem. They're in danger of overdose. What is the next step to reduce that danger versus jumping right to, their recovery? Because a lot of times, and I've seen this with friends and family, they're not ready to look at recovery, mentally, for whatever reason. Uh, but maybe they are ready to look at toning it down, or maybe they are ready to look at just making sure that they're taking care of themselves, or thinking through things a little bit more clearly. Ali, please speak up if I am saying something that is absolutely not the recommended course of
Well,
action.
I mean, there's quite a few things, and I guess for me sitting here, not that I'm struggling, but I'm thinking about so many different scenarios I've seen physically in the field of crisis work, but also working on the crisis lines, right? Because when you're only over the phone with somebody and you're hearing them in distress, you only have so much to work with until that person either hangs up or you have to take the next step. So the way that we're trained on crisis lines is, the least invasive intervention is where you want to go first. Now, if somebody calls in and says, I've taken 30 ibuprofen, we know their stomach might explode, hey, I'm drinking a bottle of vodka while I'm, taking Tylenol PM. So there's so many different avenues that you go to, avoid that potential overdose and understand, especially where the person is and everything. As we know, overdoses happen every single day. That's why I don't like when they say it's limited to one day a year for awareness. I think it should be every single day discussed, and people should be educated on it, right? But yeah, I mean, people will use different substances, and working in the field, people will say, well, I don't abuse substances. I'm not a substance abuser. So the way that I always like to word it, especially to help with de-escalating folks, is saying, sometimes we misuse substances, that's normally a more compassionate and empathetic way of saying it, because I think when we label it as a substance abuse disorder, it already has that negative connotation on it. So, educating the person, but also understanding what their symptoms are. So I know I've already kind of relayed information based on like a more higher intervention. So like, okay, the person's actively in an overdose. They were able to get to a phone and call us, or speak with me. And I say us because I'm referencing when I was on crisis lines, but um, in certain cases, right? Like we might see people that have misused substances. Maybe they got themselves in trouble. Maybe during a episode of, substance-induced, blackouts and things, they have done something to where they got themselves in trouble, and maybe they're in jail or a rehabilitation program, and, they get out, right? I had a friend many years ago who, was troubled growing up. Unfortunately, he passed away because after he had gotten out of a program, he ultimately started using again, and he used a little bit too much than what his body was able to tolerate. So it's super important when, we see people that are in recovery, having that primary support system is super, super important. I think people who misuse substances feel shame and therefore have difficulty with, speaking up and speaking to the people around them, because they're like, well, I'm just disappointing people. I'm just, going to be a failure to them, a further failure, when in reality, it could be the opposite. Those people that you're afraid to talk with can feel, happy that you're speaking with them and help you prevent those, you know, potential difficult next steps.
I think it's also, you brought up a point that I think we tend to overlook, and kind of goes back to the point about what the next step is versus where you want things to end up. Um, it doesn't happen as much anymore, to my knowledge, or at least to what I've read. But there used to be a huge problem with recovery programs where people would go into the recovery programs, and similar to what you experienced with their friends, they would, or with your friend, they would be in for a little bit, and then they would get out and they would go on a bender and overdose and die. Because as we were talking about, like, an overdose is basically more of a substance than your body can actually handle. And when you're in recovery, your body's tolerance goes down. And so a lot of people who haven't mentally committed to the act of recovery will go into these situations where they have to recover and they have to be sober, their tolerance goes down, and then as soon as they're out, they're fully intending to get high, or whatever it may be again, and their body just can't handle it anymore. And it creates, or can create, a larger problem, which is why I think it is so important. And again, Ali, if I'm saying anything that is outside of guidelines, cut me off. But I think it is so important for us to look at what is the next real step we can take, not where do we want this to end up. Because sometimes if we're taking steps too soon, we're setting people up for failure in the subsequent steps. And when it comes to things like substance addiction, when it comes to things like overdosing, setting people up for failure is catastrophic. Um, and as a family member, as a person who has known people with addiction problems, known people going through recovery, it is very difficult to accept that. It is, it's a huge ask, and I understand that I'm telling everybody, like, hey, you have to do this huge task, but you can, especially for an addict, you can be setting people up for failure in their recovery if you're pushing them through stages that they're not ready for yet. Um,
Right.
because, yeah, it is ultimately about what is the next step.
Right. And I don't think it always follows like a neat or predictable like timeline. You know what I mean? Like nothing's linear here. Like it can be in such different ways. Like it does take people quite a bit of time to realize and recognize they have a problem. Like, for example, when I've worked on crisis lines, I've had people who've called in and have stated to me that, they've done this every week, or they've misused their prescription medication, and oh, well, I just feel better because my doctor doesn't prescribe me the right dose, so I do it myself. And I'm like, wait a minute. That's not, but who I can't, all I can do is meet the person where they are and work with them on whatever symptoms they have, but then also try to guide them in the right direction. Sometimes total strangers, are more helpful to these people that reach out because again, sometimes there's lack of support. Sometimes there's no support. Sometimes you're the only support that they have. So um I say the person who is the helper in the situation for the help seeker, to be trained. I mean, maybe you don't need, MD credentials, because that's when you triage or bring in other resources that can help them, but at least have some basic knowledge of, these are the things that you can do. So, kind of getting back to your question, I mean, there are different things. I mean, I say like breaking the stigma, right? A lot of people think like, hey, if I'm in an overdose or I did take something, like I'm just gonna die or I'm just gonna let myself feel this way because I'm afraid if I call 911, like they're gonna lock me up forever. Well, that's not true. They're gonna check in on your immediate safety, especially kind of going back as well to like my friend, for example. He was a young adult when he was in the recovery center, and because of his use of alcohol and other substances, daily he would meet with a nurse, as that's regular protocol in, a facility and or, corrections or, wherever the person is that's, discontinued substance use. Um, so, he would get his blood pressure taken. He would have physical examinations to ensure that, okay, if you've used substances for prolonged periods of time, they're monitoring your physical symptoms because they have to ensure that there's no risk for withdrawal. And I think that is the biggest part of recovery and, looking out for things because, again, while people can reach out with different mental health symptoms like substance abuse psychosis versus psychosis, that and I know I'm going back a little bit, they can also reach out with sweats, palpitations, things that can mimic, an overdose, but things that can also mimic withdrawal. Um, I know I just said like a ton of like word vomit at you guys, but these are things that I think about, um, having only had access to people over a phone call that might not have been in the exact county or town that I've lived in, but in different parts of the world that I've worked with. So a lot of training, a lot of junk I'm kind of just throwing around, but it's true. It's important. It's so important, because when you're audited on these calls, "Well, why didn't you do this? Why didn't you say that?" There's so many expectations of you as the helper to the help seeker.
No, no worries, Ali. Is there a chance or a moment where you have to explain the effects on the brain when you do overdose? I feel like a lot of
Mm.
people doesn't like they don't understand what, or I mean just in general, like all anything that they're like on, like alcohol or any type of substance abuse that they're doing, but like the effects on the brain, like is that
Mhm.
something you guys mentioned when you guys are on the call?
So, I mean, you're not, so as a crisis line worker, depending on the agencies you are with, you can be a credentialed, or I say credentialed, but a licensed or, yeah, credentialed clinician. You can have various backgrounds, you can have a PsyD, you can have a PhD, but your role is acute crisis care. It's good
Mm,
when you have that background, but it's not very helpful, in the sense of, hey, I'm diagnosing you with a substance use disorder while you're in an active overdose, right? Like that's not
mm,
helpful. But what you're doing is you're providing acute crisis care to the person, de-escalating them of whatever the issue at hand is, but then also getting them and referring them to the service that's needed in this specific case.
mm,
Um, you can touch on it, but typically on a crisis call, when somebody's just so like, oh my gosh, like, walking my dog today and seeing my neighbor, that was the worst thing in the world that triggered me. Again, hypothetical example, which
yeah.
could be very real for someone.
Mm,
Um, you know, Lecturing them or providing sometimes psychoeducation isn't the way to go. Now, if somebody's reaching out for information, requesting information, maybe on behalf of somebody, so we would call that like a third party caller, right?
mm,
We can kind of give them a little bit more of that psychoeducation lesson, if you will. Um, but yeah, it's much more difficult to teach someone when they're just like they can't even retain, a coping skill right now. They can't even uh, stop hyperventilating with you on the phone when they're so upset. So, again, every case is so different, very unpredictable, but that's why you have to stand solid in the sense of being educated and knowing exactly like, okay, I've seen this before. Let's go this route. That route doesn't work.
Mm.
Let's go to B. Let's go to C. So you're kind of just working through all of your steps before maybe bringing in like a supervisor or something to listen to your call and help you. But kind of thinking about, participation of like International Overdose Awareness Day, right? Again, it's not just limited to 1 day per year. And um, overdoses don't discriminate against gender, age, cultural background, ethnicity. Anybody can experience this. Sometimes we see more accidental overdoses than anything because maybe somebody forgets and takes their, I don't know, thyroid medication twice in a day. Oh my gosh, like I didn't realize it. Like I took it, fell back asleep, and just took it again.
Mm.
Utilizing your poison control center can be super, super perfect. I can't tell you how many times on crisis line
All right.
calls.
What is a poison control center?
Yeah, poison control center. So, if you've ever, let's say, seen different commercials where if, let's say, hey, you've taken more than one, as I mentioned before, like a couple of your thyroid medications, right? That's not what your prescription says to do. It typically says call your local poison control center.
Oh.
It's an easy Google to be able to see, like, within a certain time frame, if I took this, what's the half-life of the medication? If I consumed alcohol maybe last night and I took a medication this morning, is there a chance that I can get like stomach symptoms? Do I need to go to a hospital? They can really help you in those moments of being able to say whether it's like a medical emergency. They also can bridge services to you as well, I believe. It depends on the agency itself, but I think they're super helpful. And I mean, I've had three-way conversations with poison control and an individual in crisis, just so I could also learn as well. Not that I can take any of that information for future calls, because again, every person's body's different. Their BMI, mass, body composition, their prescriptions are different, but at least helps me to know as the helper in these situations that, hey, this is a emergency. Let's get the person help because again, whether you're a person in training on crisis lines or you're a licensed, seasoned, credentialed clinician, you take an oath in helping people and each case is yours. You have a liability of if something does happen to that person, did I take all the measures that I needed to take to help them?
Yeah.
So
I mean, thank
hopefully that
you.
answers.
Yeah, you
Yeah.
did. I mean, thank you for mentioning the poison control center. I never knew such thing existed. Um, that'd be like a lot of like helpful resource to have.
Yeah, no, and sometimes people, start with a crisis line because I mean, it is in the name, right? Crisis line. I'm in a crisis. I would imagine these people would know exactly the steps of helping me. So another resource that I think of offhand, and this might not be specific for overdosing like in the moment, because again, that can be very traumatic and just needing like immediate help. But nurses lines, a lot of
Mhm.
different insurance companies offer nurses lines 24/7. And sometimes, I've gotten people who've reached out to crisis centers I've worked for and have said, hey, like, I don't have insurance. What do I do? I don't want to call 911. So, normally you can just reach out to a pharmacy, whether chat in person or phone, and they can give you guidance too on like, hey, I'm having a headache. I drank 4 wine bottles today. What can I take? Can I take anything? Because it's super, super important to educate yourself on, what I can do when I'm physically or maybe mentally not feeling well, and taking those next steps of, knowing what can be mixed or not mixed. I don't believe one should drink and take medication. Again, I'm not a medical professional. I don't have a background in it. I have friends who are nurses, doctors, pharmacists, but as a clinician, cannot speak on behalf of what concoctions can cause disruptions. But I am trained to see signs to help to prevent anything.
So that brings me to I think an important question for everybody. What does an overdose actually look like? Like how do you as a person recognize an overdose?
Um, I mean, I can honestly say the word, I don't know exactly what an overdose looks like. I can give you scenarios of ones I've seen. For example, I went to a concert a few years ago and I was standing in line and, person in front of me turned and just locked eyes with me. And it was very odd because it was like they weren't blinking. Their pupils were very small. They were like almost like little tiny pinpoints. And just started like drooling a little bit out of their mouth and they collapsed and it was almost like they were seizing in front of me and 10 people jumped on the guy. I mean, it happened so fast. Convulsions, things, that I've never seen in that perspective. I've only heard it over the phone at that point. But, he got up. They had given him some medication. They pulled him to the medical tent that was at the venue, and they were treating him. What he had taken, I don't know, but I know it happened within 5, 6 feet in front of me in the line for concessions. So it was just a very, um, traumatic sight to have seen. But, thinking about like key physical signs, right? Like this person became almost unresponsive. They were having some sort of a seizure. Maybe they drank, a combination of caffeine and alcohol and they were very dehydrated. I don't know exactly what the person had experienced, but sometimes in mental health, we see what's called the death rattle. Or gurgling. So, this is where somebody has like a loud snoring sound, choking, gurgling, because this is what happens when their airway is maybe blocked or fluids building up in the lungs as their breathing's failing, right? Um, we are trained to also see like where their body becomes very limp, their muscles are just super relaxed, and their body just feels like, very slumped over. Like I mentioned, the pupil changes, but we also might see like discolored skin and nails. So this is something that we see when there's lack of oxygen in the blood. So we might see somebody be pale, gray, purple, or blue. Now, I mention these things because these are things that we look for as clinicians, but medical providers would know better. So, like, if you suspect somebody's actively overdosing, like in that moment at that concert, again, this happens so super fast. I just thought I was in the person's direction. Maybe whatever substance they took, they were experiencing that limp body sensation, right? So they couldn't really ask me for help, but maybe that look of theirs by locking eyes with me was like, hey, I cry for help, right? So if you even suspect that somebody is experiencing an active overdose or going into an overdose, because every case is different, I would advise getting a medical professional or calling 911 immediately because as Samaritans, like there are the Good Samaritan laws, depending on where you live, of, jumping in it and helping an active emergency, to kind of protect you when it comes to CPR and things. Trained professionals have the needed equipment, they have the training, and they have the knowledge. Not saying that we don't have some of those things, but they can help, to really help the person. I know lack of oxygen to the brain over a prolonged period of time, even if somebody is jumping in as a good Samaritan, can be more detrimental than if we do get medical team services in place.
Yeah. I think it is so important to effectively call 911
Yeah.
if you suspect an overdose, because there's so many different things that can happen because of an overdose, and it is possible that us being a good Samaritan um, makes things worse. that's not saying like, hey, if somebody's not breathing or anything, don't perform CPR or something like that. Um, but there are a lot of things that mistaken assumptions can cause in those moments, and I think we should recognize that. The other thing that you talked about, and I want to bring up, I think when we think about overdosing, most of the time people are thinking about opioid overdose. What you're describing sounds to me like an opioid overdose, uh, but also I wasn't there. I'm not a medical professional either, so I don't want to say that. Um, but overdosing comes in a lot of different forms and a lot of different symptoms and treatments. Um, and you brought up something earlier that I think is really important to recognize, and that's the concept of accidental overdose. Um, I think for a lot of people, uh, you can accident like everybody can accidentally overdose, whether you abuse a substance or not, you can accidentally overdose because of XYZ. I think your example of taking the thyroid medication twice is a really good example. I think that's happened to a bunch of us where we forget we've taken our medication, then we take it again, and we shouldn't have. Um, but that doesn't make it not an overdose. And depending on the medication, depending on the results of the medication, you maybe should be calling poison control or calling 911. And a lot of us think that, you know, hey, I'm not an addict. There's no reason for me to suspect that I might have overdosed. When that's exactly what could have happened. Quick story from my own life, actually, within the last year, I take a blood pressure medication to sleep because part of the reason that I have insomnia is that my adrenaline and cortisol like doesn't go down at night, and so like I can wake up like amped. But with the blood pressure medication, it doesn't have that effect because it doesn't have the opportunity to go through my system and get me up. So, however, there was one night I took it, thought I didn't, and I took it again, got up to go to the bathroom, and just passed out uh, again before I even made it to the bathroom. And it's fortunately nothing further happened from that, but like that was an overdose. If Probably if I'd taken it a third time, there would have been a different story to this. Um, and I think it's important for us as people to recognize that that can happen. That can happen to anybody. That can happen to you, whatever, and be prepared to accept and respond to that happening.
Yeah, no, I understand that, Aaron, and you kind of brought up a very good point that I want to go into a little bit because in the middle of the night, like, I know myself, and the reason I mentioned the thyroid medication is because I'm on thyroid meds. Um, they tell you take it first thing in the morning, and when I wake up, I'm a health and wellness person. I'm hungry in the morning. I want to eat food. I want to have a coffee to get myself ready for the day. On your thyroid pill bottle, it says 30 to 60 minutes until you can eat. And I always used to wake up, take my medication, go back to sleep, and then get up. And I'd always wonder, why am I still so groggy? Why am I not like getting the full effectiveness of my dosage? But I did meet a pharmacist who became one of my good friends, and he had told me that, well, you're not taking your medication correctly. And I'm like, what do you mean? He's like, well, you wake up, you take your meds. That's good. That's the good first step. You go back to sleep for a half hour to 45 minutes to an hour, whatever. But then your body's not absorbing it properly because you're laying down. So I was like, oh, so he's like, something that we're trained to do as pharmacists to not only help you to absorb your medication the thorough, proper way, but also we discussed ways of people not overdosing. Like, if you wake up and you take it again, you know there's a chance you could overdose. I don't know your body. I'm not your medical provider, but there's a chance. So he had instructed me that, okay, let's say you have a meeting in the morning. Let's say you have something to do, or maybe you don't. Maybe you have nothing to do that morning, but stay upright, sitting up, or taking a walk, or doing something around the house for 30 minutes. That helps you to absorb because you're standing up, and it keeps you mindful that, hey, I took this, set a mental timer, a physical timer. In 30 minutes, I can eat now. So the reason I mention that is that, using different activities to prevent an accidental overdose can be super important. I don't think there's been a day since he taught me that advice. I mean, yes, there's days where I wake up, I take it, and I do go back to sleep. I'm guilty of it. We're all human. But I ensure that when I wake up, I have some sort of a reminder that, hey, before you went back to bed, you took this, because it's, something we see every day, especially, with me working crisis lines and then also in the field, right? Like, people, it happens, we're human, accidents happen, but these are the ways we can prevent it. So I mention that because I know we have quick morning routines. People wake up, they want to, eat really quick and get out the door for work, school combined. But there are little mindful activities you can do to prevent, potentially an emergency from happening.
I think that so this isn't a funny story. I don't know why I'm laughing, but when the blood pressure medication overdose happened to me, for me it was no big deal. Like, oh, I passed out and I shouldn't have. Now I got to like be aware to be more careful when I'm taking the medication. Um, for my wife, it was a huge deal. Like, she was very shaken by it, as I think any loved person would be during that situation. Because for me, it was like, oh, I passed out. I got up later. Once the effects has subsided, I went back to bed. Everything was fine. Um, for her, it was, like, I was worried you weren't going to get back up, or something like that. Um, and I think that that's also an important thing, regardless of whether it's an accidental overdose, regardless of whether it's a purposeful overdose, or whatever the cause is that um, there are knock-on effects to that, on one, on your body. Hopefully it's not a huge one, but also on the people that you love and care about. Um, a lot of times when, even if you're just not taking the appropriate steps to avoid accidental overdoses, um, you are causing stress and pressure on the people that you care about. Um, and I think that that's a really important thing to recognize with these things as well, is that there's always an additional effect. I mean, like, even in your case, Ali, you work in a crisis center, and I can't imagine that that is easy to talk to someone that is overdosing. Um, and that is a knock-on effect. Um, so I think it's important for us as people to not just look at, okay, what can we do to help those that are experiencing substance use issues, that are accidentally overdosing, that are whatever, but also what can we do to help those people that are dealing with these situations? Um, what can they do? I mean, the first thing I think of is always, hey, go to therapy, talk to somebody, whatever. Um, but there are other things. If you happen to be somebody that knows somebody suffering from a substance use problem, they're suffering from that problem, but you're not isolated from that problem. And there are things that you can do to address that, or you can do with somebody who knows that person to help address that. And to circle all the way back to what we were talking about at the beginning of this, even with that, I think it's really about setting people up for the next step. What are they ready to take? What are they ready to undertake and do? Um, because if you have, like, in the case of a substance use problem, if you have somebody who's worried uh, about somebody having an issue but is still in some way enabling them, maybe they're not ready to confront everything, but maybe they're ready to ease the enablement or make that a little bit more difficult or something like that, you know? And in my opinion, and if people disagree with me, feel free. I don't claim to be an expert on this, but a step that we can take on the road to recovery is still a step. Even if it's not the final step, it's still a step.
Yeah, no, and
I agree with that. Yeah.
yeah, I was just going to chime in that you know, it can be a very difficult thing for the person who's misusing substances to carry, but also for the loved ones around them. I think we all know the show like Intervention. That's been all over. You probably see more clips of it versus full episodes now, just with technology. But you know, you can see the exhaustion on people's faces, like if their, let's say, child lives with them after losing their family, losing their home, losing their job due to the misuse of substances. And you know, I have personally worked with people in the field that will still say they don't have a problem even when they've lost so much of their identity from using substances. And um you know, you can guide people to understand that the patterns that they've taken have led them there, but you can't force them to stop. You know, that has to come from them. We've seen, you know, intervention where, you know, people have said, you know, hey, like you can't live here, you know, you can't be a part of our family if you don't at least go to treatment. And, you know, sometimes that works for some people, sometimes it doesn't. It actually makes them feel more isolated. So, again, case by case scenarios here, but, you know, taking those steps, you know, for yourself, whether it's calling a crisis line can be helpful. If you're the person who's, you know, concerned with your substance use, whether, you know, you're afraid of a medical emergency or calling on behalf of a loved one. I mean, I think those are all very commendable steps, even though they're difficult. And there are people that can help you. You know, maybe that's not the first point of contact that you wanted. Like if you are experiencing symptoms after taking medications or drinking or a combination of the two, like I know sometimes it's scary to call 911, but you're not going to get thrown away and locked away for life for, you know, doing something, right? Like I know those are the potential fears, but there are services that can be bridged over for you, just depending on what the case is. So I think something that's important here to say is, you know, we can tell you about education, we can tell you about resources available, but we can also ease the fear behind what a call looks like, behind what a medical visit or evaluation looks like, because I know those are the unknowns and the scariest part.
I think fear is like you perfectly worded it, Ali. I feel like a lot of people are afraid, you know, to go to the family members. Um, if the if a substance abuse is such a thing, right? So I think what you said was perfect. Thank you.
Um, I also, we ran out of time really quickly. We only have like 12 minutes left, but I do want to talk about, and I don't even know if I'm saying this correctly, naloxone. Um, the I'm assuming, like I read a bunch of stuff, but I have not ever seen this done. But I'm assuming it's the needle. You're like clear, and then you jab it, and people wake back up. I don't know if that's actually what it is, but it's a opioid overdose treatment. Um, and I think that when we talk about something like that, when we talk about overdose treatments, and you have a family member that may have a substance use problem or something like that, there's a stigma around just carrying the remedy, because on some level, if you're carrying the remedy, you're acknowledging that this might be a problem or that this is a possibility. And Ali, you said something earlier that I think is the perfect analogy for that. So I'm going to give it to you to say about why you should carry the remedy.
Yeah, so if it looks like I'm staring off in space, it's because I wrote it down. I thought of it and I was like, let me say it in a way that advertises it where it doesn't seem like, oh, you have this, it's such a bad thing, right? But nobody wants it to rain, but it's nice to have an umbrella in your bag just in case. Having a kit in your car, backpack, or medicine cabinet simply means you're prepared. So people are going to probably question that statement and say, well, what does it look like? Like, what am I looking for? Am I looking for something with a giant label of Narcan or Naloxone? Well, no. Um, Really, it looks like a standard over-the-counter nasal decongestant spray. That is what it looks like. Now, for the sake of time, and because I'm not a medical professional, I'm not demonstrating how to use this or anything like that. I'm sure there are resources available by medical professionals with credentials that you can watch if you're more curious on those things. But I always say that, these things are in place, not as a scary intervention, but kind of like I referenced, like a safety belt or a first aid kit for the respiratory system, right? Because it, can help somebody with breathing. You might go to your local gym and see that they're equipped with it. You might go to, well, certainly hospitals have it, but a restaurant, there's many different establishments that if you feel concerned of wanting to know if they are equipped with these things, you can always give them a call, but it's out there, it's there for your protection and the protection of others. So I think it's a great system we have in place.
Absolutely. Um, I love that analogy just because my partner's overly prepared all the time. Um, and her family gives her crap for it, but in her car there are four umbrellas, one on each door. Um, and her family always makes fun of her because like she's got umbrellas ready all the time. Um, and this year, and Robbie can attest because he lives pretty close to me, we've just had storm after storm after storm after storm. Um, and those umbrellas have come in very much like a very handy. Uh, Maybe was it 2 weeks ago? No, yeah, 2 weeks ago. Um, we were at an event and it just suddenly started downpouring, and then we had four umbrellas for people to like go to their car and move the presents and everything. Um, and it was very useful. And I think that preparedness is easy to make fun of, but also foolish to do so because it's very useful, especially if it doesn't really cost you anything. Uh, you know, and yeah, there's the cost of the medication, the umbrella, whatever it is, but is that really a large cost in the scheme of things? Um, it's not. It isn't. Um, and I think that the biggest struggle going back to, the next appropriate step for people is really just admitting that it's a possibility. That's a tough thing to stare down. And I think a lot of us, you know, do things around not wanting to admit something's a possibility all the time. Like a lot of us may avoid going to the doctor because we don't want to hear that there might be bad news about whatever thing that we don't want to think about. And it's similar. But the next step that I would challenge to everybody um, is there a possibility? And if there is, take that next step, get prepared. Um, it doesn't have to be you're stopping something. It doesn't have to be, you're fixing everything, but just being able to take that next step, admit that bad things might happen sometime is the next step, uh, is is so important and can ultimately be the difference between success and failure in somebody's road to recovery. Sorry, that was me up on my soapbox with that. Uh, but I do think it's very important for us to recognize that. And I think I did not have anything else I wanted to add to this, other than, again, reiterating that recovery is a process. And even if it's an accidental overdose, recovery can still be a process. And it's important to just take the next step. Set yourself up for success in the next step. Set the people you love up for success in the next step. And beyond that, I want to thank everybody who participated, everybody who does this work. Ravi, Ali, thank you so much for being here. Thank you to LAMCO Wellness for sponsoring this. They do have great resources, not for crisis, but for potentially the steps after crisis. Absolutely reach out. And, we started today wanting everybody to feel more prepared, and I hope that we do. But you don't need to be a clinician to recognize that something's wrong, call for help, and potentially save a life. I think knowledge gives us the ability to act, and acting without judgment or stigma can be the difference between success or failure in somebody's road to recovery. So thank you, everybody, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you, Aaron. Thanks, Ali.